Measuring the Man, the Writings of Frederick Douglass on Abraham Lincoln, gives readers an insight into how Douglass's early criticism of Lincoln gradually turned into admiration. It sheds new light on the most critical period of American history and provides new perspectives on Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Lucas E. Morel and Jonathan W. White join us to talk about Measuring the Man, which they co-edited. Lucas Morel is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics at Washington and Lee University. Jonathan W. White is a professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University and vice chair of the Lincoln Forum. Both of my guests have written or edited multiple books about Abraham Lincoln. Lucas and John, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, there's so much more in this book than we're going to have the opportunity to talk about in this brief interview. So flip a coin, but could one of you give me a brief overview of what readers are going to find here?
Well, I'll begin. Thank you again for having us on your show. Measuring the Man, the Writings of Frederick Douglass on Abraham Lincoln is truth in advertising. We have here not a hagiography of Lincoln, only the things Douglass said that were cool about Lincoln, nor is it a hit piece on Abraham Lincoln. Let's just take down the greatest defender, in my opinion, of the American founding, the American experiment. What we have is an honest play-by-play, pretty much account and commentary of Douglass over time between 1858 through 1 year before Douglass dies, which is 1894, an account of kind of a running commentary on the things he likes about Lincoln and a whole lot of things that he doesn't like, or at least a few things that he keeps bringing up that Lincoln falls short in his mind. And so we have 100 documents that are excerpts from his third autobiography, letters, editorials, speeches, pretty much everything Douglass said about Lincoln. So it's an anthology that you get, Jonathan, and my expert commentary by way of introductions and the footnotes, which I'll be honest, could have been twice as long, twice as many. We wanted to take mercy on the reader, but there's plenty of good stuff in here, including a couple of really mind-blowing revelations that we did not go looking for, but were astonished to find.
Well, we'll learn more about that in just a moment, but let's start with Frederick Douglass and his feelings toward Lincoln. What did he find at fault with Lincoln? Why was he critical of Lincoln during the Civil War?
So Douglass first becomes aware of Lincoln in 1858 when Lincoln runs against another Douglass, Stephen Douglass, for the U.S. Senate seat in Illinois. And Frederick Douglass reads Lincoln's very famous House Divided address in 1858, and he actually is impressed by it. He likes what Lincoln has to say, that this nation will eventually become either all slave or all free. And for Douglass, he says, or he thinks, we're going to become all free. It's inevitable at some point that has to happen. But by 1860, when Lincoln gets elected, Douglass begins to have a very different view of Lincoln. And a lot of that was rooted in their view of the Constitution. Frederick Douglass believed that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, and that if you just got an anti-slavery president and an anti-slavery Congress into power, they could do things to end slavery in this country. Lincoln, by contrast, believes that the Constitution allows Congress and the president to ban slavery from moving into federal territories, but that the Constitution allows a state to have slavery if they want to have it. And so when Lincoln takes office, he doesn't move to end slavery right away because he doesn't believe he has the constitutional authority to do so. And even worse, I think, in Douglass's eyes, Lincoln says he will enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which is one of the most egregious laws ever enacted by any U.S. Congress. And so when Lincoln becomes president, he pledges not to touch slavery where it exists or to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. Douglass says the South has no reason to secede. They've got nothing to fear. He says Lincoln is an excellent slave hound and abolitionism's worst enemy.
So we have two opposing opinions here, obviously, on the issue of slavery. I guess what moves did Lincoln make that eventually allowed Frederick Douglass to say, he's going in the right direction, perhaps I should change my opinion of him?
Well, number one, the obvious thing that, Lincoln's known for two things, savior of the Union and the Great Emancipator. So, on that second point, number one is Lincoln finally gets around to emancipating slaves during the war. Well, he promised he wouldn't touch slavery where it existed when he became president for the first time on March 4th, 1861. What changed? Well, what changes? Now you have a war. He's not a peacetime president anymore like he was on March 4th. He's a wartime president, and things aren't going well in 1862. And Lincoln decides, and he tells his cabinet this privately in July of 1862, that if they have a significant military victory, that he would issue an Emancipation Proclamation. He actually wanted to do it sooner rather than later, but was cautioned by one of his cabinet members. It's either Seward or Chase. Jonathan will correct me.
Seward.
Thank you. His Secretary of State, Seward, says, hey, maybe good idea, but timing is important. We don't want it to be like the papal bull against the comet. In other words, it's just ink on paper and has no authority or effectiveness to it. Wait for a military victory. That victory turned out to be the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. And so Lincoln eventually promises to emancipate slaves in rebel-held territory. That comes on January 1st, 1863, the famous Emancipation Proclamation. So Douglass is cheered by the fact that he hasn't abolished slavery everywhere, and he hasn't abolished the institution. One thing people have to remember is emancipation frees individuals, but it doesn't get rid of slavery as an institution. And so Douglass still thinks Lincoln is coming up short, Congress is coming up short. But with the emancipation, even though it's under military necessity, which is the only reason Lincoln thought under the Constitution he could do it, he'll take it. But he thinks more needs to be done. And he also likes the fact and is overwhelmingly joyful that now Black people and Black men can actually serve in the Union Army and be able to defend something that they can now consider their own, a country. We can have a country now, and at least loyal whites will be sympathetic to our plight and give us the rights we deserve.
I'm curious about the relationship between Frederick and Douglass. I'm sure a lot of the ideology was exchanged through, writings and speeches, etc. But how much face time did they actually have?
So they met 3 times. The first time they meet is in August of 1863. And on this occasion, Frederick Douglass showed up at the White House uninvited, unannounced, not knowing whether or not he would actually get to see Lincoln. And what's interesting about that meeting is it's the first time that Frederick Douglass traverses the soil of the slave state of Maryland, where he had been born, since he had escaped from slavery decades earlier. And so Douglass shows up at the White House and waits his turn and gets welcomed into Lincoln's office. And Lincoln takes him by the hand and brings him in to have a seat. And Douglass tries to introduce himself at this meeting, but Lincoln cuts him off and says, I know who you are. Mr. Seward, the Secretary of State, has told me all about you. And so we know that Lincoln had been aware of who Douglass was before that meeting. Now, Douglass came to the White House that day to push Lincoln on Black equality. Black soldiers were enlisting in the Army, but they were not being treated equally. And in fact, Confederate government policy was to treat Black men in uniform as slaves in insurrection and to either have them executed or enslaved. And so Douglass pushes Lincoln on these issues, and Lincoln listens to him, and they have a conversation. And essentially, Lincoln concedes and says Black men will eventually get full equality, but I can't do it just yet. And Douglass goes away from that meeting not wholly satisfied, because he wanted full equality and he wanted it now. But he did go away with a new appreciation for the political constraints that were on Lincoln, and also an appreciation for the fact that Lincoln treated him as an equal, didn't treat him differently on account of the color of his skin. They met a year later in August of 1864, when Lincoln actually invited Douglass to come to the White House. At this point, Lincoln thought he was going to lose in his bid for re-election in November of 1864. And so he brought Douglass in, and they had a meeting to try to strategize, how can we free as many slaves as possible before Lincoln is out of power? And then the final time they met was in March of 1865 at Lincoln's second inauguration. They met at the reception at the White House after the inauguration and had a really beautiful conversation where Lincoln asks Douglass, what did you think of my speech? And Douglass says, my opinion doesn't matter. And Lincoln says something like, there's no one whose opinion I'd rather hear than yours. And, Lincoln actually invited Douglass to tea at the Soldiers' Home, what is now the Lincoln Cottage in Washington, shortly after that. And Douglass turned him down because Douglass said, I had a speech that I'd already lined up. I'd been invited to deliver, and I'd accepted the invitation, and I never turned down, I never turned back something that I've already accepted. And then, of course, Lincoln was assassinated. And so Douglass lost that fourth opportunity to see Lincoln. And he later said, if I had known that would have been my last chance, I would have canceled that invitation and gone to see him.
So it sounds like they had a much better relationship shortly before Lincoln's assassination. But you write in the book that his response to the assassination was a bit controversial. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, the controversy is actually something that I don't know anybody knew before Jonathan and I discovered it in a British newspaper that had published the contents of a letter that Douglass wrote to a British abolitionist, Julia Griffiths Crofts, just a few days after the assassination. He expressed what most people in America expressed at that time in April of 1865, which is tremendous grief and mourning over a man he had considered now a very good friend. But in that letter, we see the consummate political activist that Frederick Douglass was. He was consumed by seeking civil and political full equality for Black people, free and enslaved, now becoming emancipated, for Black Americans. And what he shared is, you know what, this might be a blessing in disguise for us. Yes, I mourn Lincoln, but he actually thinks that Andrew Johnson is going to be, anticipates that Johnson's going to be a better Reconstruction president than Lincoln had Lincoln not been murdered. The reason for this is in October, a number of reasons, but in October of 64, Johnson's on the ballot with Lincoln as his vice president. He emancipates slaves in Tennessee, which was excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation. It's unclear whether a governor actually has that authority, but whatever. Johnson emancipates slaves, and that very day in Nashville, he gives a speech to a predominantly Black audience, and he says to them, essentially, I will be your Moses. And so from that and other things, right, he's the only senator from a seceded state that stays loyal to the Union. He becomes military governor as a result. He's part of the Union ticket in 1864. And so in that speech, he says, I will be your Moses. You will live in a state that is going to treat you the equals of whites. Douglass thinks that Johnson, as hateful as he is towards the planter class, what was known as the slave power, he thinks that having grown up and lived his entire life in a slave state, he would know that planter class cannot be treated gently, kindly, all the things that he saw in Lincoln in terms of personal qualities that kept the Union together among loyal Americans, a unity they needed to suppress the rebellion. But he thought those very qualities that were good for what they needed, keep the country together, is not going to be what's necessary in the South, where the vast majority of Black Americans lived. They're going to need rights, and of those, most importantly for Black men, they need the vote to defend themselves politically. I think Johnson is going to give them the vote. Lincoln's going to make them citizens as soon as possible. He wants to restore, Lincoln's preferred term for Reconstruction, restoration. He's going to want them in those states back in the country sooner rather than later. Blacks are going to be governed by ex-rebels. Totally not fair and dishonorable. And so, to quote, he says in this letter to this British abolitionist in April 65, Douglass shares with Julia Griffiths Crofts, which she releases to the newspaper, Mr. Johnson is in many respects better qualified for the work to come than was Mr. Lincoln. And so Jonathan and I were like, whoa, this is a big reveal for us, a big discovery. In fairness to Frederick Douglass, he changes his mind pretty soon. By September of 1865, he realizes, wow, Johnson's actually a better friend to ex-rebels than ex-slaves.
So that was a surprising revelation to discover that letter. But there were other things that you were able to bring to light as well that changed your thoughts about what was going on during that time. What can you tell us about some of those other discoveries?
Yeah, so in the book, we reproduce 12 documents that have never been anthologized before. A couple of them are speeches, one is a eulogy, but then 8 of them are letters to British abolitionists. And as Lucas alluded to, in these letters, Douglass was much more candid with the British audiences than he was with American audiences. And so they reveal some views of Douglass's that American scholars and scholars of the Civil War have not known about before. And some of the most remarkable, in November of 1862, Douglass writes a letter where he's reflecting on how emancipation is coming about. So November of 62 is after Lincoln has publicly announced emancipation is coming, but before Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And Douglass writes a letter to a British abolitionist where he essentially points to the irony of the fact that there had been a pro-slavery general, George McClellan, who was really slow to act and really resistant in terms and reluctant of attacking Confederates, that if McClellan hadn't been in power and a general winning battles had been in power over the Union armies, that emancipation wouldn't have come. By January of 1863 and then moving forward, Douglass continues to talk about the need for Black freedom, and he talks about how fearful he is of Reconstruction coming about. For Douglass, he knows that while the war is going on, you have Union armies in the Confederacy who are bringing about freedom and protecting the rights of Black Americans. But Douglass worries about what happens when the war ends. What happens when the armies are withdrawn? And so Douglass actually writes to these British audiences saying essentially, I don't want the war to end because I'm fearful of what will happen when the war is over. Will Black people still have their rights protected? And then one of my favorites actually is a letter he writes in September of 1864, where he describes his second meeting with Lincoln in ways that no one has seen before. I mean, even down to describing Lincoln's personal appearance. He says that Lincoln has aged 5 years since Douglass saw him a year earlier. But in 1864, Douglass wanted a radical named John Fremont to become the president. But Fremont was running essentially as a third party candidate. And Douglass admits in this letter, he says, as perfect as or as pure as a candidate like Fremont might be, he doesn't have a party. And if you don't have a party, you can't win votes. And you need votes to win an election. And so Douglass writes, he says something like, I'm becoming more practical now than I have been in former times, meaning I want the best candidate in terms of a radical who's really going to act quickly, but I recognize you got to win. And Lincoln's the guy who can win. And so Douglass says, I'm doing everything I can for Lincoln's election.
Well, as I mentioned, there's so much more in this book we won't have time to talk about, but what new appreciation or understanding of Douglass and Lincoln do you hope that readers will take from the book?
Well, for me, it's Douglass in retrospect, recognizing the challenges that Lincoln had to do so many things on so many fronts. And the fundamental one is a comment he makes in his most famous eulogy of Lincoln, which comes many years later. It comes in 1876 when Reconstruction is going, I was about to say south, really bad. It is just souring. Almost all the former Confederate states, the ceded states, so-called, are now back in the hands of former Confederates. So the prospects for Black people in the United States, most of whom live below the Mason-Dixon line, couldn't be worse. And in the dedication speech, he's called upon to give a speech on the dedication of the Freedmen's Memorial in Washington, D.C. You essentially read in this speech the perspective of an abolitionist who grows in his appreciation for Lincoln as a statesman. He said, viewed from the abolition ground, Lincoln was tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But that isn't the end all and be all. We got to think about a man who has to bring along the country, and that means the loyal country, and that means a whole lot of white people in support of keeping the Union together in order to produce emancipation. Lincoln could not have done that if he reversed the order, if he had pursued an abolition war, which Douglass wanted from day one. Lincoln refused to do it because he didn't think he had the constitutional authority to do it. But viewed as a statesman has to consult public opinion and the loyal opinion of that country. Again, the vast majority of whom are white. He said, viewed from that perspective, as a statesman, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. For me, that is the peak of Douglass's appreciation for the challenges that Lincoln had to confront and deal with in a country that is governed by consent of the governed. You have no option. He didn't have the luxury of choosing his voters. He had to take a whole lot of votes from people who didn't care a whit about Black people, but loved America. And he said, okay, come with me if you love America. Let's do the right thing here in hopes that we can do the right thing by Black people.
Well, as we look back in history, obviously this was a very divided time for our nation regarding slavery and other issues. So what does history teach us about contemporary America today? Can we draw lessons from that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we can learn a lot by looking at two great leaders and how they interacted with each other. One of the things I think is most important, both of these men valued free speech and free exchange of ideas and listening to one another. When Douglass went to the White House for that first time, he didn't know how Lincoln would greet him, but Lincoln welcomed him in and listened to him. I mean, Douglass is someone who had been so critical of Lincoln. Lincoln could have easily justified tuning him out or not letting him in, but Lincoln welcomed him in and engaged with him in conversation. And they both moved forward. They both changed their views of certain political issues. And I think that can be a really important model for us today.
To learn more, the book is Measuring the Man, The Writings of Frederick Douglass on Abraham Lincoln, edited by Lucas E. Morel and Jonathan W. White. Lucas and John, thank you for talking with me today.
It's been great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
If you'd like to purchase Measuring the Man, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.